Hello, everybody. You guys just did that Stalin worksheet. Now you should be on this in your guided notes. Obviously, just doing this to make sure we're all at different paces here, working at different speeds. So you guys just started reading about Stalin, looking into the man in terms of, what he did, some of his big policies. So again, make sure you're filling this in your guided notes. So kind of here's where we're at, guys. The Soviet Union after World War One. Obviously we talked about this, the Treaty of Versailles effects. Again, just to reiterate, they dropped out of World War One. They left the war early, and a part of the deal when they left the war early, they made a deal with Germany. So in order to drop off and in order to drop out of the war, they made a deal with Germany. Basically, they give up some of their land, and they agreed in the treaty that they wouldn't have much of a say so within the outcome of the Treaty of Versailles. Um, so when this happened, again, they lost land. Um, and I think that kind of in a way they were kind of expecting if the Allies were to win, U.S., Britain, and France, they were kind of expecting or hoping that maybe the Allies would maybe reinstate that land with Germany since Germany lost, but they didn't, and this left a really bitter taste in their mouth. Remember, going back even to the Civil War, on how, on how the British and the French and the Americans were helping out the White Army during their Civil War because they didn't like communism. So during the war, they experienced an enormous amount of debt and an enormous amount of loss of life, casualties within the Soviet Union. And then you had that Bolshevik Revolution, as I said, that swept up the country. Even after World War One. So 17 provinces, over half of the people were starving within the Soviet Union well after World War One. So you got to understand that in terms of things that we talked about, with the Russian Revolution, really starting in the 1900s, and how there were problems within the Soviet Union. Well, now after World War One, that's 20 something years where a good segment of the population within the Soviet Union were experiencing starvation and poverty and homelessness and inflation. So again, think about all the revolutions that we've talked about, and how the one common theme behind them is poverty and hunger. Um, so the Soviet Union is in really, really poor shape, really throughout the first part of the 1900s. And a big part of the problem is that the Soviet Union was a highly agrarian society, meaning it was farming. So they were kind of behind the eight ball, guys. Like they were like stuck in like the old school mentality. The rest of the world was changing. The U.S. changed into an industrialized nation. Great Britain changed into an industrialized nation. Germany has turned into an industrialized nation. Japan has turned into an industrialized nation. The Soviet Union really hasn't kind of caught up. So this is a problem. One is that in terms of technology, infrastructure, railroads, things of that nature, the Soviet Union is again way, 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 way behind. How can they compete with other industrialized nations um, in terms of war, in terms of business, like the U.S., Britain, Germany, and Japan, if they're lacking those things? So as we talked about, the leader of the Soviet Union is going to be Joseph Stalin, also known as the Man of Steel. And when he gains power within the Soviet Union, he's going to turn the Soviet Union into a highly industrialized society. He understands that he needs to transition from an agrarian society to an industrialized society. And in order to do this, as you guys read about in your guys' readings, is that he's going to use terror tactics and labor camps. Basically, anybody who's not on board and willing to follow through with his policies, which again has to be drastic. He doesn't have 50, 75, 100 years in order to industrialize. He has to do it like within 5 years, and that's very, very, very difficult to do. And the only way to industrialize at that rate is to use extreme tactics. So as you guys read about, the amount of people that he's going to kill throughout his reign is going to be staggering. 20 to 30 million people, which is pretty crazy. One of the things that he did in order to get this is going to be Stalin's 5-year plan. So from 1928 to 1932, basically what this means is that the government is going to take total control over the economy and industry. So think about that in terms of one, on how you're going to be upsetting a lot of people within the Soviet Union. Under Vladimir Lenin, the original leader of the Bolsheviks, he gives small plots of land to farmers, and he allows the farmers to grow their own food. Um, so that's popular. But when Stalin comes in, he realized that's a huge waste of land, and he needs, in order to industrialize, he needs food to feed the factory workers. Again, going from farming to factory workers. So what he's going to be doing is he's gonna take all that land that was given to them under Lenin, and take it and give it and basically have it be under government control. So all those little tiny plots of land that Lenin gave them, he's going to take those land away and create these big, huge uh, farming fields where the government is going to run, and the government is going to produce the food they need in order to industrialize. Um, so as I said, the 5-year plan, ultimately what he wants to do is to industrialize the Soviet Union. It's his plan to do that. And the reason really why he wants to do this is that he wants the Soviet Union to become self-sufficient. He doesn't want any foreign help. He wants to show that communism can work and can become a model for the rest of the world, which is ultimately his goal. His goal was to spread communism over and have it be like a world concept and overtake capitalism. Again, why? As I said before, he needs to catch up to the rest of the world. Here's the problem. The problem behind this idea is that you have this land-owning peasantry that was around with Lenin, that you're giving people land, and all of a sudden now you're taking it away. So you're taking away people's freedoms and their independence and their right to work for their own bread, for their own food. So you can only imagine there's going to be a lot of people who are going to resist, at least at first, Stalin's plan. How will they react when land and resources are taken away? And ultimately, you're going to have cases of sabotage. We're going to have groups within the Soviet Union who are going to try to sabotage and hide grain and hide food so Stalin can't take it. Now, you see this right here, this poster from 1929. It detects 8 groups that were basically blamed. Landlords, kulaks. Kulaks were people in Ukraine, the landowners. Journalists, capitalists, white Russians, Mensheviks, priests, and drunkards. So Stalin's going to create this enemy that all Soviets and all true communists are going to blame these people. So as the 5-year plan gets rolling, and when there's going to be still going to be food shortages. Again, Stalin can't take the blame for that. He needs people to buy in, and what he's going to do is that when there's not enough food that's being made, he's going to be blaming these groups as they're sabotaging. They're not doing their part. They're not giving to the rest of us. They're not patriotic. So these people are going to be scapegoated, and it's going to be a big part of who he's going to target in his purges and in the killing process, which leads me into which we'll get into here in a minute. But the idea of collectivization. So this is kind of what I just talked about. This was the first part of his 5-year plan to convert these small, privately owned farms into large collective farms. They call that collectivization, going from small little individual plots to these big, huge things. So I just talked about that in the last slide. So again, if you need to pause this to write this down in your guided notes, go ahead. But a lot of this I talked about. But ultimately, its goal with why they did this is that if you have these big plots of land, the idea would be that you increase your food supply. You grow, you mass produce food. Now, they didn't really actually achieve this. They didn't actually produce enough food because, as I said before, there was groups that were sabotaging, which was partially true. There were some groups that were doing that, which we'll get to here in a second. But ultimately, he wanted to free up the labor so they could work. So 20 million people in the farms were now sent to work in factories. So problems, as I said, peasants were denied basic rights and freedoms to make their own decisions. They couldn't pass down land to kids, which back then, if you were a landowner, that was kind of what you were given to your children as when you passed. Now that was taken out of their hands and given to the country. And as I said, there was sabotage and resistance. So. One of the examples, they call it Stalin's Famine when they went to the Ukraine. Which again, this is again a modern example of what's going on now with the Soviet Union, Russia, going to be invading Ukraine. This is something that's been going on for over 100 years now, if not longer, where you have the issues and you have Russians living in Ukraine and yada yada yada. But there was a group of Ukrainians called the Kulaks. This was the large landowning peasants. And this group resisted Stalin's collectivization and 5-year plan. They viewed this as like the second serfdom, like and how the you basically have no chance to mobile up. Government controls everything, keeping the peasants starved in poverty, and ultimately Stalin's goal was to liquidate this class, meaning to get rid of. So you can arguably say that this was an example of a genocide. He targeted the Kulaks, he targeted Ukrainians, he targeted that class, and he's going to wipe them out one by one by using food as a weapon. Essentially, he's going to take these kulaks' food, all their grain that they grow and they work on these land, and they're going to give them a very, very tiny amount. And then over the years, they're going to keep taking more, keep taking more, keep taking more. And eventually, Stalin's going to send in the Red Army to make sure that they're getting the grains and food from this class. And again, you see by the pictures, starving them out. And as you guys can see, at the very last point down here, this led to deadly famine, starvation in Ukraine. Over 6 million Ukrainians are going to die in this time span from 1932 to 1933. Many of the most capable farmers are going to perish from this. But again, Stalin didn't care. He needed this land, which was the Ukraine was known for their farming lands. And ultimately, he didn't care if the Ukrainians died, because ultimately he needed that land to feed the rest of the Soviet Union. And if you weren't on board with this, you were sent to labor camps in Siberia, the Gulag. So, a pretty crazy time. Again, in some cases, going back to the whole sabotage thing, the kulaks are going to slaughter horses, cattle, and pigs rather than give up their food to Stalin, which will basically allow him to clamp down more and send in more army into Ukraine. Now, changes of modernization. This was the greatest industrial growth in any 10-year span in the history of the world. To what Stalin did, going from a fully agrarian country, farming country, to an industrial nation, it was truly staggering. But, as I said, it came at a cost. Britain was gradual over many, 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 many years. America and Germany was rapid, but still, it wasn't nowhere near to the 10 years as what the Soviet Union did. The Soviet Union became the largest producers of railroads and farm tractors in the world. They became large producers of iron and steel. Only the U.S. and Germany outproduced them. So they climbed up the chain really quickly. They increased trade with some Asian neighbors. And ultimately, because they industrialized, this saved the Soviet Union because of Operation Barbarossa when the Nazis are going to invade Russia. If they didn't do that in World War II, they would have had no chance to stop Nazi Germany. But as I said, there was a human cost element to this. Citizens had to forego consumer goods. Their options were very limited because, again, the government controlled everything. They controlled all output. That's what communism is. It's country over individual. So your consumer choices were very limited. In some cases, you couldn't buy consumer goods because, again, it was what was best for the state to industrialize. So that was the big concept. And in many cases, a lot of the Soviets lacked food. They lacked proper housing. A lot of the housings that they did have was not adequate or up to date with the rest of the world. Again, the focus was on industrialization, not on the individual. If you resisted, you were killed. And many of these workers who worked in the factories worked very hard for very low wages. Again, there was no movement up, no incentive to make more money because you weren't going to get it. And then finally, this led to, Stalin was very, very paranoid, and this led to the Great Purge. These were a series of show trials, meaning that old Bolsheviks, Stalin couldn't trust the old Bolsheviks that were accused of traitorous activities. He believed that many of them were trying to assassinate him because of all the issues and rapidization of industrialization. He thought some of them were trying to restore capitalism. He also felt that a lot of them were loyal to Trotsky and Leninist ideas. And basically, these show trials were that they were an act. Their guilt was already predetermined. They basically said, sign this guilt paper before the trial even occurred, and they had to confess their crimes. And if they didn't confess, their families would be killed. So many of them confessed their crimes after torture and threats to family members, and they were promptly executed by firing squad. So it made it seem like they were given a trial, but they really weren't. Behind closed doors, they were being threatened. Over 750,000 were killed this way, and 20 to 30 million were dead over the course of his reign. So here's a picture of the Gulag here, and up in Siberia, very hard labor conditions. All right, adios.